Hi, I'm Jake Black, and I'm the CEO at Treehouse, where we're a research and development company focused on new cannabinoid-based ingredients and really pushing the forefront of what's available and possible for different consumer packaged good industries. I would like to thank Growth for inviting me to give this talk today. I'm really honored by the invite, and I'll be focusing today on the different technology and integrity of hemp-derived ingredients in particular. So what I'd like everyone to get out of this conversation today is a base understanding of how these different ingredients are produced. So if you have no familiarity with the production of hemp-derived ingredients, hopefully you can leave this talk today understanding extraction, distillation, and isolation. Then I'm also going to do a bit of a deeper dive into the science behind some of the more advanced processing technologies, such as THC-removal, THC remediation, and even synthesis of unknown or non-naturally occurring cannabinoids. And so that's going to be a bit more of the deep dive, but I hope everyone can gain something from this talk today. And one of the primary aspects I'd like to focus on is really regulatory compliance and product quality, so that if you're sourcing hemp-derived ingredients, maybe you are planning on developing your own consumer packaged good product, that you have a good understanding of what to look for from a hemp-derived ingredient supplier and the questions to ask, and really can understand the intricacies of the technology. And also hopefully a little bit of a regulatory briefer. So I'm not a lawyer, but at the same time, I've dealt with a lot of these regulations from a science standpoint, and hopefully I can communicate some of the nuances there as well. So to start, I'm just going to go into the different processing methods that let you take, this biomass, this industrial hemp biomass, and get all the way to potentially, say, CBD Isolate, a refined white powder, and all of the different steps that kind of go into that process. So it all starts with extraction, which is where you take the biomass and you process it into a crude extract. Generally, the two main methods that are used in the industry are either solvent-based extraction or CO2, supercritical CO2-based extraction. And there's some pros and cons to both, and I'm going to dive in there right now. So with solvent, it's more common. The equipment, capital necessary to perform those extractions is just kind of a lower bar. So most processors are using a solvent-based extraction, and for the most part, it's ethanol. So that's really how you should think of solvent-based extraction. It can be USDA organic certified. So if the processor is using USDA certified organic ethanol, then it can be certified through that means. And then there's CO2 on the other side, which is also has the potential to be USDA certified organic, but not necessarily every specific extractor has that certification. And the kind of comparison of the crude extracts, the difference is probably that with CO2, there's probably more of a terpene-rich profile because you don't have to evaporate the solvent. It's CO2, and so it kind of just naturally evaporates at room temperature. So when you're just looking at crude, there might be a slight terpene advantage to CO2-based extraction, but as we're going to discuss, once you go down the processing steps, those benefits kind of begin to diminish as you go through further processing techniques. And I think now is a good time to bring up one of the biggest regulatory concerns for this industry is that as soon as you extract industrial hemp, and industrial hemp just by definition per the DEA is that it has less than 0.3% THC. So as soon as you extract that plant, it almost inevitably is going to have above that 0.3% THC. And so that is where you're now entering into regulatory concern with the DEA. And so, again, that's going to be a large topic of discussion that we're going to get into more later, but I just wanted to bring that up. So the next step is really then distillation, and that's where you take the crude extract, which is normally very, dark green, brown. There's a lot of other plant matter in there as far as the compounds. There's fatty acids, there's terpenes, things like that. And then you want to go through distillation to refine the cannabinoids. And so that process is commonly used to get to a product that has maybe a 75 to 85% potency of CBD. If we're focusing on CBD-rich strains, and at that point as well, concentrate your THC. And so you're going up the level in THC through each of these steps as well, which again is a pretty big regulatory concern. And then the final step in this whole process is really crystallization, and that's to get to a pure compound, CBD in this case. And so I'm going to share a chart real quick to kind of illustrate how the composition changes going from biomass all the way to CBD isolate in this example. So what we have is a different cannabinoid composition of biomass. And so you start with industrial hemp. Key thing to look at here is it has 0.3% THC. So at or below 0.3% THC, it's defined as industrial hemp. So that's great. You'll also notice that the cannabinoid, the CBD potency, this is a really potent strain. It has 17% CBD. And so that's kind of your starting basis for the whole processing. The next step is to look at what happens when you extract it. And so right off the bat, you get a much higher potency of CBD. You're looking at 51% in this example. It's kind of arbitrary. But you'll notice again in red, the THC has shot up about threefold as well. And so it's certainly no longer an industrial hemp material. Now moving into distillate, so you've gone from biomass, this industrial hemp biomass, into crude extract, which is composed of mostly cannabinoids at this point. And I guess now is a good minute to mention other material. In the industrial hemp, other material is mostly fiber. It's the leafy stalks and all of that. Once you're in extract, it's generally fatty acids, proteins, and terpenes. And then moving into distillate, we've now concentrated the cannabinoids even more, and their CBD is at 75%, but you'll notice again the THC is now high in the 1.5% range. And so all of these products now are above the legal limit. And so a processor and a ingredient purchaser needs to be very considerate of what that regulatory implication is with the DEA's rulings. The last step here is going to CBD isolate. So that's a pure compound, and that's just an example of what it would look like. There's no other terpenes, there's no other material, there's no other cannabinoids. It's back to being federally compliant, but you've lost all of the other cannabinoids there. So as I brought up a bunch already, how can we deal with this THC issue? There's a couple different ways to solve this problem, and they have their pros and cons, just as the extraction methods did. So the main considerations are the DEA's rules, and they've even recently come out and restated that anything, even if it's derived from industrial hemp, if it has above 0.3% THC, it is non-compliant. It is considered, a DEA illegal product. And so transporting it, processing it, purchasing it with above that 0.3%, it should be a concern for everyone in the industry. And I think they're working to get to a better solution for dealing with this and more clarity. But as of right now, that's kind of where it stands. The other aspect to think about is this entourage effect. And in the industry, to briefly summarize that, it's the notion that multiple cannabinoids put together have a different effect than just one cannabinoid in isolation. And so you can imagine if there's CBD with CBG, CBC, that product could have a different effect than just CBD by itself. And it's thought to be an additive and enhancing effect. And that's why people really want the entourage effect. So now thinking about, okay, crude extract distillate, they have an illegal amount of THC. What are my options? So the main options there are dilution, chromatography, or THC remediation. And so at Treehouse, we have performed both the chromatography aspect and remediation. And so we have patented and patent pending processes for both of those stages, but I'm going to run through all of them so that hopefully there's a good understanding. So dilution is the most common, and that's really just adding something back to the mixture. So you take that THC level from the above 0.3, so say it's 1%, you add a bunch of oil back so that it gets down below the 0.3. And so typically it's hemp seed oil or coconut oil, MCT oil. Those are the most common additives. The issue there is that, great, you can dilute the THC back down to under the legal limit, and that solves your DEA issue. But on the entourage effect, this benefit of multiple cannabinoids, you really kind of hinder yourself there because you're diluting not only the THC, but you're diluting the CBD, you're diluting the CBG, and you're diluting the CBC. And so the product quality, though it is compliant, you're not getting the full benefit of all those cannabinoids and terpenes. And so that's kind of a summary there. Generally, people will dilute and then they'll add CBD back in order to get a higher potency. And so on a COA, you'll see, maybe 70, 80% CBD if they added a bunch back, but you'll see almost no other cannabinoids. So the COA will only show CBD, and that's really not then a broad spectrum or full spectrum product because there are no other cannabinoids there at that point. So the next option is chromatography. And again, it has the solvent-based one, so either ethanol or other solvents, or supercritical CO2. So those are both options. But what you'll notice with chromatography-based methods, and again, I'll take a step back actually. Chromatography is where you specifically use this chemical processing method to kind of pull a sliver, one compound out of the mixture and leave the rest together. And so you can do that with THC and pull out the THC while leaving a lot of the other composition intact. Unfortunately, with a lot of those chromatography methods, they also take out CBC. And so you end up losing another valuable cannabinoid. And so when looking at chromatography-based removal products, you will probably see some CBG, but almost no CBC in those products. And again, diminishing your entourage effect that so many people are seeking. And the final method, and this is another patent pending method at Treehouse, is remediation. And so what we do here is we convert the THC into CBN, and thus we leave the whole cannabinoid profile intact. You get your CBC, you get your CBG, you also get CBN as a kind of added cannabinoid, and you have a non-detectable THC product. And so it's compliant, and it really gives you your best bang for your buck from an entourage standpoint. And so another good thing there is it's USDA organic certified. And so you can have, all the way from USDA organic grown hemp all the way through the end of the process, this THC-free product that has a really rich cannabinoid profile. And so those are the main processing technologies out there and kind of how to view them and also how to look for them from understanding a COA standpoint, certificate of analysis, if I didn't mention that before. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to dive a little bit more into, gets a bit more advanced on the chemistry side, but hopefully everyone can still follow along. That's my goal. So when you get all the way to a cannabinoid isolate, you're looking, we'll talk about CBD first. So CBD isolate is a white powder. If it's processed correctly, it's 98 to 100% pure. There's no other compounds there. It's THC free. And that's all good and great. And so that's the primary method of making CBD isolate. Caveat here is that with current processing technology, it cannot be USDA organic certified, and that's because the solvents that are commonly used in this crystallization process to make the isolate are non-USDA certified organic. And so I'm sure there's a way out there, and it's something we're working on to get a USDA organic certified CBD isolate. But at least as of today, I've not seen a really good scalable industrial solution to that. And so that's kind of the natural way to make CBD isolate. You crystallize it from the distillate. And that process is the same as you see it in sugar and honey, where if you put honey on the shelf and it gets cold, it'll harden and there'll be crystals. And that's actually the sugar crystallizing. Same thing happens with salt. If you leave salt water out and all the water evaporates, you get salt crystals. And so it's the same process, and it happens with a lot of different compounds. And that's really kind of how you derive your isolate when you're talking about CBD. Then looking at a couple other cannabinoids, just to kind of, chase out the nuance here, we can talk about CBN. So CBN is a cannabinoid that's of great interest. A lot of people want to investigate it for its potential in kind of as a sleep aid. There's not a lot of scientific literature backing that up to date, but there's promising, anecdotal evidence. And so it's really of interest down the sleep lane and could be a really good help in that avenue. But it's not really naturally produced from the plant. It's a degradation product of THC or CBD. And so over time, if the plant is just kind of sitting in the field and it's stopped growing, you will see CBN starting to build up. And that's because it's an oxidation product of either THC or CBD. So in that sense, you can find it naturally, but it's a very slow process if you just let it happen in nature. And so what people have done is they found kind of synthetic methods to take CBD or take THC and turn it into CBN. And that's all kind of, good, fine, and dandy if you're doing it correctly in a controlled environment and you care about the impurities and you care about the FDA's rules on that. But unfortunately, in this industry, a lot of people just don't. They just don't care that much, and they're not worried about the impurities. They're just trying to make a quick buck. And so, when you're thinking about CBN, it becomes very important to consider how it is derived. And so in a synthetic process to make CBN, you would take CBD Isolate, for example, and you would add some sort of catalyst to it. So this is an extra ingredient that speeds up that conversion from CBD to CBN. And commonly right now, those catalysts are either iodine or palladium. Again, if you're doing this in a controlled, very scientific and regulatory compliant environment, it can be done in a safe way. But if you're doing it in your garage or without any of this consideration, it can be very dangerous. And so if you add this catalyst, we'll talk about palladium first, and you convert CBD to CBN, great. You've now, have your CBN isolate. But what happens to this palladium? Is there controls to take that palladium out of it? Also, are you able to test for it? And so when you're normally looking at a plant-based ingredient, why would you be looking for palladium? You look for common metals that occur in soils, such as arsenic and lead, and things like that. And those heavy metal tests should be standard for any product you are purchasing. But those tests don't cover palladium because there's no real reason they should. But if you're aware that a synthetic method could be implemented in this case, then you would want to know that is happening, and you would want to test for palladium to make sure this heavy metal is not getting into your end consumer product goods and that people are eating it, right? That's a very bad situation. And so if you are purchasing CBN, you should be asking, well, how are you getting it? Where is it derived from? And what method are you using? And can you provide me some evidence that I don't have to worry about this palladium? Or in another case, iodine. And so iodine is another common catalyst used to perform this reaction. Unfortunately, though, iodine is also a very common allergen. And so it's implicated in shellfish allergy, which is pretty common. And some people can obviously have very acute shellfish or iodine allergies up to a point where they are fatal. And so if you're buying a product that you think is naturally derived and you have no idea that iodine's been used in it and somebody eats that, you could be in, literally, lives could be at stake. And so that's something that, again, should be talked about with any supplier. And you should really understand, hey, are you using iodine to make this? Is there iodine left? Can you prove that? Those are the questions that a kind of buyer of hemp-derived ingredients should really be asking. And so that kind of covers the CBN aspect. And then another one that's recently become a hot topic is delta-8 THC. And again, there's a scientific interest, and then there's a kind of regulatory interest. And so from a regulatory standpoint, there's this thing known as the Analogs Act. And essentially it says if there's an illegal compound or substance, anything that is substantially similar to it and has similar effects is classified similar as that substance. And so delta-9 THC is explicitly called out by the DEA as a substance that is a class 1 narcotic. And so delta-8 THC, from a scientific standpoint, again, I'm not a lawyer, but from a scientific standpoint, I would certainly call it an analog, and I would certainly say it fits into that act as an analog. And so there's a lot of opinions out there from different regulators and lawyers. Do your research there, but be very careful when purchasing delta-8 because it, again, from my scientific opinion, it is essentially a class 1 narcotic, even if it is derived from industrial hemp CBD. Additionally, there's the same synthetic concerns as there was with CBN when you're talking about D8. Again, the biggest thing here is consumer safety. All of these products need to be manufactured in a way such that consumer safety is really the most important thing. And then there is a way to do that. And at Treehouse, that's our focus. And I think that should be the industry's focus as well. And so with the proper consumer safety protections in place, I do think there's just a vast field of potential for synthetic cannabinoids. And I'm really excited about this potential. Treehouse and my passion is really in all of those other cannabinoids. There's over 100 other known cannabinoids. Almost all of them have no research behind them. We don't know what they do, but based on what we found with CBD and THC, there's just, a ton of promise that some of these cannabinoids will be able to treat a variety of different ailments and really help people, live a better life. And so that's where I'm most excited about moving forward. And I do think synthesis is going to be a part of that, because some of these rare cannabinoids are just really hard to access without that sort of advanced chemistry. And with that, that's really kind of my talk today. We went over the different extraction methodologies, going from crude to distillate all the way to isolate, some of the pros and cons of those different methodologies. We talked about THC remediation, both from a product quality standpoint with the entourage effect and then the regulatory concerns as well. And then obviously we went into the synthesis and the kind of potential there, the ability to reach some of these rare cannabinoids and really help people. But again, consumer safety has to be the number one thing. These are going into humans' bodies at the end of the day, and it needs to be, as safe as humanly possible. And that has to be everyone's concern. I mean, that's Treehouse's concern, but I think that needs to be the industry's concern as well. So thank you, everyone, for listening to me today. Thank you, Growth, again, for inviting me here to give this talk and share kind of insight into what I'm most passionate about. And hopefully everyone learned something new here today. And really, thank you, everyone, for your time. If you have questions, I think there's going to be a way to go through Growth to ask me. I'm happy to answer them. Have a good day.